Trauma is different things to different people. So it all depends on how an individual interprets and perceives that event. So what is traumatic for one person may not be for another. In general terms, the Red Cross deals with a variety of incidents which are potentially traumatizing for people. Stephen Regal, I'm a senior psychosocial practitioner with the British Red Cross. When people are exposed to a traumatic event, whatever that might be, they would experience a whole range of reactions. And the greater the experience of that trauma, then the more intense and the prolonged the reactions may be. But it's very normal for many people who have been exposed to a traumatic event, whether that's been a road traffic collision or seeing somebody die in the street, for example, is that most people would experience intrusive images of the event, for example, thoughts that would pop back into their head for some days and sometimes weeks afterwards. They may have problems with their concentration, they may be irritable, they may have, sometimes people experience dreams and nightmares about the event. Most of these things will tend to dissipate for many people after a few weeks. So the intensity and severity and the duration of these reactions would tend to diminish over time for most people. For some people they don't, and for those of the people we would encourage them to seek support sooner rather than later. Whilst it's understandable that people may want to avoid thinking about it, talking about it, being in the environment, listening to reminders or hearing reminders, reading the newspapers, watching the TV, that's okay in the first 2 or 3 weeks, that's understandable. As human beings, we don't like pain, whether it's emotional or physical, so we want to avoid things like this. So what we would say that what's helpful is that it's very often helpful to start encountering those things that we're perhaps avoiding gradually over time, because we know that if that avoidance, whether it's mental or behavioural avoidance, if it increases over time, the things will indeed get worse for people. Psychosocial support, in its simplest terms, is what I would describe as being there for somebody who is at a time of crisis, when they may not be able to understand what's happening to them. They may not be able to make sense of their emotional and psychological response to their experience. And through the psychological support, being there, listening, and that support that you offer somebody, through the kind of normalizing the reactions and possibly signposting them at that particular point, can be really important at times of crisis. Because what we find in the evidence is that people who have early support tend to have less problems in the long term, because they can access additional support and help sooner rather than later. And that's when the work of the Red Cross is really important, because we see people relatively early on. So what we can do from our perspective is help them to normalize their reactions, to say that this is something that in time will gradually diminish. However, if it doesn't, then they need to seek support sooner rather than later, and we can often signpost people to appropriate sources of help. What we do know, and we have significant evidence to say, that social support of any kind, whether it's for individual support, family support, community support, and a support through their organisation or through other sources of community support, such as the church, as an example, this is a significant protective factor for people who have been through adverse life events and trauma. We have significant evidence to show that it's a protective factor. If it's not there, if social support or organisational support is not there, then it becomes a predictor of longer-term distress over time. British Red Cross respond to many significant events, and sometimes these might be the individual events that some of our teams would go to, or sometimes the big events. So supporting peers in that kind of an environment and having that regular support from a colleague who understands and has a good understanding of the work that you do in that environment is really important, because they can relate to what you might be feeling, what you might be thinking, and the sort of experiences that you've been through. So that's why it's really important to have somebody supporting you who actually does the same work that you do.